Welcome back to another episode of the Feisty Heroine. My name is Rachel Beck, and I am your host for the show. And I am super excited for today's episode, like I always am. But today I have a very special guest. I have Dr. Yuthika Girme, and she is an associate professor and the director of the S.E.C.U.R.E laboratory in the Department of Psychology at Simon Fraser University. Dr. Girme is a leading expert on singlehood and relationship science with a focus on social support, attachment insecurities, emotion regulation, and social stigmas. Dr. Girme's research takes a comprehensive look at the conditions under which both intimate relationships and singlehood are associated with challenges and when people in intimate relationships and who are single can thrive. Her work is regularly published in a number of leading social psychology outlets, and she is also the recipient of a number of early career research awards in her field. This episode is jam-packed with awesome information, so let's get started. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah. So if we could just start off with you introducing yourself a little bit, talk about your job, where you're located, background.
Yeah, so I am an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Simon Fraser University, and I lead the S.E.C.U.R.E lab, which is the Singlehood Experiences and Complexities Underlying Relationships lab. So I'm a social psychologist, and I predominantly focus on research, trying to understand what factors help promote well-being among single and coupled people.
Very, very awesome. And I feel so grateful that I found you as I was doing research for my podcast. I was like, wait a minute, what is this? What is this girl doing? I was like, she's doing some really cool research. And so, how long have you been doing that?
Oh, it's probably about 15 years now. Yeah, it's been a hot second.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's always interesting because I feel like when I talk about the work that I do, people are always surprised, like, "Oh, there are scientists who actually study, like, singlehood and relationships." So, yeah, it exists, it's a job.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important job. I've, read a couple of your research articles, and you have talked a little bit about how singlehood is increasing, right, across the world. So, can you talk a little bit about that and maybe how you got into it, like how you got interested in this area?
My story into psychology kind of goes all the way back to undergrad, where I actually really wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And sort of on that journey, took a close relationships course and absolutely fell in love with close relationship science. Like I thought it was the most fascinating thing that our close relationships with family, friends, romantic partners can be like the absolute best thing for us, but also the absolute worst. Uh,
Right, right.
and that kind of got, like that dichotomy I thought was just really interesting. And from sort of at that moment, I had this sort of pivotal sort of shift in my career trajectory where I sort of, I say I broke up with clinical psychology and really sort of pursued close relationship science. And a lot of my early research focused on trying to reconcile the costs and benefits associated with romantic relationships. So trying to understand like what are the factors that help people have really secure and satisfying romantic relationships, and under what conditions do people really struggle in their romantic relationships. And one of the things that I sort of learned along that journey is that singlehood is actually an important piece of the puzzle. Because I think some of the things that make relationships really costly for people are some of the reasons that people get very drawn to single life and life without a romantic partner. And so that really started my research interests in trying to understand singlehood. And I really do think that singlehood and romantic relationships are sort of two sides of the same coin. You can't truly, fully understand one without understanding the other. And so that's sort of what got me into singlehood studies and research around single people's life and experiences and their well being outcomes. And as you mentioned, it's a really important topic. A, because it's received very little empirical attention in close relationship science or in psychology. But the other, really important reason is that we're living in a time and age where the rates of singlehood are the highest that we have ever seen, at least in modern human history, right? And so there are more and more people who are living single and solo. And this is not necessarily just like younger people who are delaying marriage or committed relationships. We're seeing singlehood across the lifespan. So there are more young people who are single, but there are also people who are middle age or older, who might be have remained single or who are re-entering singlehood due to things like separation and divorce, or like widow, becoming a widow sometimes earlier than one might have anticipated in life. So, yeah, so it's becoming really common, and so, it's like in some societies, it's almost like an even split between the number of single versus coupled adults.
Yeah,
So it's a decent and a significant, yeah.
that is a significant rise. And I think it is important because you mentioned, being widowed. Like I'm in my mid 40s and I already have a couple friends that have lost their spouses, and we'll talk about like singleism and some other things in this interview, but yeah, it is rising just for different reasons. So your work is very important.
And, like, one other thing to note as well is that it's not just rising in, like, a North American context.
Oh, okay.
We're seeing the rise of singlehood essentially across most societies,
Wow.
yeah, across the world. So we're seeing it in North America. We're seeing similar trends in South America, Europe, Asia, Australasia. So it's a global phenomenon, and I think it's important. It's a population that deserves our research attention.
Hmm. So I know you have a lot of research, so I know we have limited time. So you've done a lot of work around the fear of being single and then the relationship pedestals theory. So can you talk a little bit about those and wherever you would like to start?
So this is work that we've done on predominantly this idea of relationship pedestal beliefs, which is this idea that you have to be in a relationship to be truly happy and fulfilled in life. And this sort of idea has been really fascinating to me because I think it's really a reflection of the society we live in and the values and beliefs that we kind of hold important in society. And so if you think about, what are the life milestones that we celebrate? What are the events that we televise? What, the big parties and things like that in our own communities and families and that we gather around people and help support. Like it really is about romantic relationships and marriage and starting a family. And so this is the idea of this like ideology of family and marriage, which is a term actually that was coined by Dr. Bella DiPolo, who's done a lot of work in this area. And it's essentially this idea that our society really values and to some extent creates privilege for people who are coupled up or married. But these ideas don't just live in a vacuum, like kind of in society. They're also values that we can endorse as people. And there's research showing that even children as young as like 3, they start developing this kind of they start playing house, right? They kind of understand notions of marriage and family life. So these are sort of messages that we get exposed to from a very young age.
Right.
We were interested to try and understand, like what happens when single people actually endorse these beliefs because that sort of goes directly against their single status at the time, right? So we conducted some research where we asked single participants to rate the extent to which they believe that people have to be in a relationship to be truly happy. And then we also assessed their fear of being single, which is just sort of general fears and anxieties about sort of remaining single. And what we found was a positive relationship between those two variables. And so people who thought that you have to be in a relationship to be truly happy, that also made them more fearful of their single status. And that was associated with actually being less happy in their life. And so it's not just that these things are actually related, it also has sort of important outcomes. Like it's making people feel worse about their livelihood.
Like less than because they
Yes.
haven't checked that box kind of thing.
Exactly, exactly. And so this is sort of, it's interesting and I think it's important because I think if I mean, I'll preface that I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to be in a relationship, but I think it's this idea that if you really put it on a pedestal, like that's gonna suddenly, fix all your problems and it's gonna just be like the magic pill to life, then that is something that like, maybe think about why you believe that and sort of consider if that's actually true or accurate.
Right. And I think there was something in your study also that you found some similar things within people that were coupled.
Yes, yeah. So in our final study, we actually wanted to see like, is this just for single people or because you can have a fear of being single regardless of your relationship status, right? You can like it makes sense that when you are single, you might have a fear of being single, but you can actually have a fear of being single even when you're coupled. And that basically looks like, wanting to hold on to your romantic partner and relationship. And the thought of like leaving that relationship and being single is frightening.
Oh,
Or,
interesting. Yeah.
it's like sometimes this is when people say, like, oh my gosh, like I'd rather be stuck in my shitty marriage than be divorced.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I was wondering that, like, if you have had any research with that of like people staying in maybe some unhealthy relationships because of that fear of being single.
Yeah, so I haven't done research, but Dr. Stephanie Spielman and Dr. Jeff McDonald, they've actually done a lot of research on the fear of being single. And they do find that if you endorse or if you experience greater fears of being single, you're more likely to sort of settle for less in romantic relationships, seek out ex partners, like,
Been there, done that.
yeah. And so what we found is we basically replicated those findings though in a couple of samples. So even if you were in a relationship, if you felt that you have to be in a romantic partner to be truly happy, you were more fearful of being single. And not only was that associated with you feeling less happy in life, but it also meant that you were less happy in your relationship. So it's interesting because I think, again, it's not that the idea of wanting to be in a romantic relationship is bad. I think that's very normative and valid, but it's giving it that weight and putting relationships on this like pedestal that seems to be not a healthy outlook on relationships.
Yeah. And I think like expecting our romantic relationship to be everything for us, right? So kind of letting some of our other relationships fall by the wayside because we're putting all of our eggs in this one basket kind of thing.
100%. Yeah.
So as far as like the relationship pedestal method or like the theory, can you like for those maybe that don't really quite understand what that is, can you just like say like summarize what that might be?
The measure, like the actual measure of it, or
Yeah.
yeah, so it's just the idea that or the belief that you might have that people have to have a romantic partner in order to be truly happy and fulfilled in life.
And did you find any differences between like age or gender or any of those variables?
We did sort of like we did try and see if any of those variables might kind of help explain some of these effects, but we didn't get a whole lot of differences there. This seemed to be like a fairly consistent finding. And all our different studies, we had some studies that were done on younger singles, like never married singles, but we also had more community participants from, with more diverse ages and relationship status backgrounds and things like that. So it seems to be like a fairly broad belief across ages, across gender. And as I mentioned, we saw it both within single and coupled people. And I think that's because these are really broad societal messages, right? So it would be odd if only, a small group of people or a very specific narrow group of people got that messaging. So yeah.
There's a lot of like talk out there about like individual inadequacies about like being single versus like societal pressures. And I think sometimes like, we have these, and I don't know if this feeds into the fear of being single, but like, people look down upon people that are that are single or like think that there's something wrong with them. So in your studies, did you find anything like, you know, related to the individual, like the attachment style, those things, or was a lot of it the societal pressures?
Yeah, so it is a bit of both. One of the things that I have been interested in doing in our research is really trying to understand why single people might be at risk of having a low well-being. And this is because historically, when people conducted research on single and married people, they would often find that married people are reporting like greater happiness, greater life satisfaction compared to single people. But a lot of that historic data didn't really consider why. And I think that why piece is very important because there might be many reasons why certain groups are at risk for low well-being. And a good example of this is looking at sort of racial disparities. If you take a look at people with racialized backgrounds, they might, and the research will show this, they tend to report low well being, they tend to be at greater risk for health problems and mortality risk. Now, is that because there's something wrong with racialized individuals? No, it's because, and as we've discovered through research and through sort of social policy work and stuff like that, that it's because there are societal barriers and systemic issues that make life more difficult for racialized individuals, right? So I think in the same way that when you look at discrimination in other groups, I think it's important to consider like that why piece. And so with the singlehood, and this is not to necessarily equate singlehood and singleism as being the same as sort of racial discrimination, but what we wanted to do in our research is try and understand the why. And so what we did is we looked at single and coupled people's perceptions of whether they felt supported by their like close network and whether they felt that they experienced discrimination because of their relationship status. And what we found, and we found this effect across a few different studies, including sort of community samples, nationally representative samples, and even among young single people, is that single people do tend to report low well-being compared to coupled people. But that's partly because single people are reporting less social support than coupled people, and they're reporting greater discrimination compared to coupled people. And both of those things help to explain like the low well-being that single people experience. And so this is important because it really moved away from our sort of individual deficit narrative that, oh, single people are unhappy because there's something wrong with them. And it brought forward this idea that, well, actually, single people might be unhappy because of how other people are treating them. So I do think that that piece is really important to consider. But you mentioned attachment insecurities, and I think that that is also an important piece of the puzzle. So we also have other research showing that single people, we essentially had them complete questionnaires to assess their attachment styles. And we found about 25% of single people were secure in their attachment to close others. And, they were sort of self assured in themselves. But an overwhelming majority of our single sample were insecure in some way. Either they had sort of more anxious tendencies or avoidant tendencies, or were fearful. And so, and we know that attachment is a really strong predictor of well being generally. So there is probably part of the explanation may also be about, individual insecurities and fears that single people might be experiencing. But of course, attachment insecurities arise because close others have let you down in the past or have made you feel insecure. And so I think a lot of these things are quite intertwined. So I don't think it's just like no one just sort of is lonely and miserable, like in a vacuum. Often, when people do experience insecurities, it is because of the hurt and rejection or betrayal that they may have experienced from other people. And so our research is really trying to understand the social context that single people live in and how we can sort of better support single people in our communities that, by understanding that and being more aware of that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good, really important point to like intertwine them because it's kind of like a feedback loop too of, if you're constantly hearing from your family, like, oh, when are you going to settle down? Or I remember this even with like an older cousin of mine, they're like, oh, why isn't she getting married? Or what's wrong with her? Like all these things. And I was like, maybe she just wants to be single. And I think sometimes there is that narrative of like, "Oh, there must be something wrong with that person if they haven't settled down by now."
Yeah, and that's exactly the thing, and, single people are hearing their family and their friends and their community members talk about them that way, and that doesn't feel nice, and I think often sometimes it might even, like, people may start internalizing those messages and start thinking like, "Oh, yeah, like, maybe there is something wrong with me, like, why can't I find somebody?" And so I think that's it's just it can be really problematic, and I think often we don't think about the impact that that has on single people and even the questions we ask. Like, I've actually stopped asking my single family and friends about their dating life. Because I think that when the first thing you ask someone is, "So, are you seeing anybody?" It really kind of, what is it communicating? It's communicating that that is something that is valued and that's something that you should be putting your time and energy into. And so, like, if my single family and friends want to, if I say, "Hey, so like, what's new in life?" And if they wanna bring that up to me, like, "Oh, yeah, I've been dating," or "I'm seeing someone," then I'm happy to talk about it. But I think that, like, those directive questions can sometimes, even though they might be well-meaning, they might come across in a way that's sort of hurtful to single people.
Right? Or like accusatory of some in some way or like make someone defensive kind of thing. Yeah, I like that, like being able like asking open-ended questions. I think just in general, I think even if we think about this as I'm in the US and, like, when I go to Europe, people are like, why do Americans ask about your job?" And, like, "Why are these the things" what do you do for a living?" I think we have these narratives that make us feel safe, right? I think sometimes we ask questions that make us feel safe. And the same thing with the, "Are you in a relationship? Are you dating anybody?" To kind of make small talk or 'cause that's like a practice that we've been used to.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's a cultural script, right? So
Yeah,
we kinda
that's that
just
you say it so much better than I did. I just kinda rambled. That was so much better. Cultural script.
But, I mean, I think you're right, I think that's what it is, and I think sort of just bringing awareness to the idea that single people feel the social pressure, they feel that they feel discriminated against, and so, just even questioning ourselves in terms of, like, how do I approach my single family or friends is an important one for people to kind of consider, and as a single person too, like, oh, that's giving a label to how I'm being treated, right? Like what people like, it makes me feel bad, but this is why. It's because it's a form of social exclusion or social pressure. Not being invited to social events because, oh, well, it was all couples, didn't think you'd really want to be there. Like, yeah.
Well, it sounds like it kind of then also like, the cultural script kind of could reinforce the relationship pedestal theory in some ways.
Yeah. And I think that's really where comes from, right? Like if we have this ideology of family and marriage as a society, it bleeds into cultural scripts. For example, another cultural script that we have is, and you could probably finish off this sentence, first comes,
Oh, then comes marriage.
yeah, well, first comes love, then comes marriage, and then comes
The baby carriage, yes.
yeah, so it's like again, I think these are just like, cultural scripts. They're super heteronormative, they're super marriage and family orientated, and I think we just sort of learn and pick these up as we kind of, mature in society. And it happens in I think often such subtle ways that we don't even recognize it.
Well, you were talking earlier about, playing house, and I had, like, an extended family gathering a couple weeks ago because my aunts from out of state were in town, and my cousin has 2 young girls. I think the oldest one is in second grade. The other one's in like, she's 3. And my one aunt brought a bunch of like old baby dolls because she was like, oh, these were my daughters. And just to see those girls like running towards them, like, I was just like, in my head, I was like, oh my God, this is just, reinforcing the cultural, norms. And I was like, it was like happening right before my eyes. I was like, oh, this is, part of it.
Yeah. And as you say, it's very gendered because
Yeah.
I think if my 2 boys had shown up to that party, they may not have been given those dolls necessarily to play with, right? They would have been given the trucks and
Yeah.
the Legos and the dinosaurs and things like that. So it is very the script in itself is inherently gendered too. So, yeah.
There was a study that you did. It was about like discrimination and being single. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like with the genders, did you find that there was like women experienced more discrimination about being single than men?
We we actually didn't. So, this is actually some work that, I did with one of my graduate students, and she was really interested in looking at sort of the intersection between gender and singleism. And so we ran studies where we asked single men and women about like how much personal discrimination do you experience because of your single status. And we genuinely thought that single women would say that they experience more than single men.
Yeah, that was my assumption before I read your study. Yeah.
Yeah, and we thought this because actually a lot of qualitative studies, so a lot of sort of focus groups and interviews, studies that have been published using those methods, there have been many focusing on single women and a lot of the like unique discrimination that single women experience. So there was sort of, there was empirical reasons for us to believe that too. And we actually did not find any differences in personal discrimination between our single men and women. These were all single men and women who were over the age of 36.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And so and we recruited people over 36 because this has sort of been like set. I didn't make this rule, but it's sort of like the age of normative like marriage age. And so anyone sort of who's beyond that, it's like they're probably the ones who are going to be experiencing more singleism anyway, as opposed to like our 18-year-old single men and women. And so that's why we focused on sort of an older sample, but we didn't find any differences. And the only difference that we did found is when we asked the single men and women, how much discrimination do you think other single men and women experience? And what we found was something called a person group discrimination discrepancy. So, what this is single women saying, I personally don't experience discrimination, but other single women do.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And they thought that other single women experience more discrimination than other single men. So so it's interesting, and we're kind of we're not quite sure exactly what's happening here, but it actually replicates similar studies who have looked at discrimination in racial contexts. So, for example, if you ask me, Yuthika, you're a brown woman. How much personal racism do you experience in your day to day life? I might say, well, actually, not that much. But if you asked me, well, how much racism do you think brown people experience just generally? I would say, oh, a lot, right? So we see kind of similar effects with this person and group discrimination bias and discrepancy in other contexts. Some of it could be a coping mechanism, like maybe single women are saying that they experience less discrimination because it kind of helps them cope with the gender discrimination that they might be experiencing. But we're still trying to figure out exactly like why that might be. Yeah. We also in that study asked single men and women to tell us like how do you think other people see you as a single woman and a single man? And then we sort of coded a lot of the open-ended responses,
Oh,
and we
interesting.
came up with 4 prototypes of single people, the sort of hardworking, independent archetype, the anti-committal, heartless, single archetype, the carefree, archetype of a single person, and then the sort of loner, lonely, awkward, antisocial archetype. We wanted to see whether maybe we get some differences in how men and women are perceived, through the stereotypes. And again, we actually found very few differences. If we did find differences, they were things like maybe people said, and sorry if this will be explicit language, so heads up. But people might say, "Oh, she's a slut," or "He's a player." So people may have used sort of slightly different languages, um, but the underlying connotation was like sexually promiscuous. So we didn't actually find a whole lot of differences between how single men and women are saying they experience singleism and how they believe they are sort of stereotyped by people in society. Which, yeah, it was a little surprising to us, I'm not gonna lie. We were sort of experiencing huge differences. But yeah, there's sort of more work to be done in that front, I think.
Yeah, I think thanks for sharing that. I was surprised by that study when I read through it. I was like, "Oh." And I don't know if it's because, like, social media or, there's more women on social media or if that is something that, or even when I was doing research for this podcast, like, you look up, like, single older man and bachelor comes up. You look up single older woman and spinster comes up,
Yeah, and this is a
and it's, like, interesting.
it
Yeah.
is interesting, and this is exactly why we thought we'd see those differences. I mean, there's 2 points here. One, you are right, like, women are socialized to, disclose more in terms of what their experiences are like, how they're feeling, what they're thinking. So part of this could be that single men we might not just be hearing their stories. And there was one recent qualitative study done focusing on single men, and it did showcase that single men are also experiencing discrimination. They also experience the pressure to partner. They have sometimes their concerns are maybe slightly different in terms of like feeling like they have enough to provide for a partner, like in terms of being financially independent and being a provider and that kind of thing. And so, or if they're single for too long, their masculinity gets questioned, their sexuality gets questioned. So I think single men also experiencing challenges. Maybe we just don't hear about it as much because they're not talking about it as much. But the other point to think about and consider as well is that I think what it means to be an independent single woman is different potentially to what it means to be an independent single man in terms of how you're judged by others and sort of the implications of that, right? So, what I mean by that is if I'm an independent man, people think I'm competent and a go-getter and, like, I'm really good at my job. Whereas if I'm an independent woman, then it's like, "Oh, well, she's a bit bossy and direct and, like, she likes to tell people what to do."
She's difficult.
Like
She's yes, yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, even the name of this podcast is I really quite love it because it's like the feisty heroine, and it's like, yeah, you're kind of owning some of that language, but often it's used in a way to like demean women and to question women, and so even though I think we're seeing similar stereotypes being used, and men and women sort of saying that they experience similar types of discrimination, it may have down the road consequences for single women that might actually be quite different to what single men experience. And I think that's something like we're actually trying to do some research in that area right now to try and like figure that out. But yeah, it is, I think it's a very interesting intersection trying to examine gender at the intersection of singlehood. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I now that we've made this connection, I just look forward to following your research and, because I think it is, really important and kind of going back to that point of that singlehood is increasing, not just in the US or Canada, it's, globally. I know there's, like, a huge movement in South Korea called the Bee movement, where the landscape is really changing, and that's a very conservative society, so it's, one of those things where things are popping up here everywhere.
Yeah, and yeah, this I've also been following a little bit of the trends in South Korea, and I think that's really interesting too because they have, I think, pretty much one of the lowest fertility rates around the world, and so their government is really trying to encourage people to partner up and to have kids. Like, I think their fertility rate is something like 0.3.
Yeah.
Like, I think for every 3 women, you have 1 child or something like that. Like,
Wow.
it's yeah. And so it's but if you actually and they're doing all these things to encourage people to have kids, but if you actually ask women, like I read an article on this, and the woman was saying, like, they're open to being in relationships, but they're like, "But not with these men," because they I think part of this is the traditional society they live in, right? So these women they're educated, they work, they have careers that they love and that they're passionate about, and they really don't want to get married and then have to give all that up to stay at home and raise kids. So I think it's kind of like a push for equality, and they're wanting men in their society to step up and be willing to help and, help raise their kids if they're gonna have any, and help support, like, women's careers, and it's like, well, if you're not gonna do that, then why would I bother getting into a relationship, and why would I bother having kids? So, yeah, so it's sort of a lot of intertwined issues about this topic, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, like, my goal for this podcast, it's definitely not anti-relationship. I am focusing on women, but I think it's kind of just following my own story of, you mentioned earlier of because I'm divorced, and as soon as I got married, I remember the question started about having kids, and I'm like, I haven't even really taken off my wedding dress yet. Like, I don't know what's happening here. Like, and we kinda get on this escalator, of one thing comes and then the other, but without, like, a lot of support around raising kids. And because I was a school counselor for 14 years in New York City public schools, before doing this. So, I understand the movement in Korea because, it's like, "Hey, you want us to do this, but where's the support for us?"
Yes, and that's not just in Korea. Like, I mean, I live in Canada, and Canada, on the grand scheme of things, has very good support for parents. But, still, I'm like, I think about like my kids' school schedules and the summer camps and like everything, and I'm like, oh my God, like it's built for family structures where one parent, I think most likely the female parent in a heterosexual relationship anyway, is meant to stay at home to pick up the kid at the random hour and take them to this other thing at whatever hour. And I'm like, it's not built for dual income parent like homes. So yeah, there's a lot of pieces. There are a lot of structural societal pieces to this, and I think sort of equality and both just like at the personal level, but also at a societal level is a very much an important piece to try and understand some of these trends.
Yeah, and I think, like, kinda touching on the singleism thing again, I remember being a single woman in New York, and it was just there's, like, a lot of single tax things, like, you have to pay your own bills and things, and so our societal structures haven't quite caught up with this new trend of more single households, and so it kind of people are just we don't really know what to do, right? Because 'Cause we're like, "Oh, well, if I get in a relationship, things will be cheaper," like, there's all these, like, things, so
And some of it is also, again, like as a society, it's like how we structure our infrastructure too, because really the homes that we build are built for families.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Yep.
and not like, and a very like kind of, traditional 2 parents, 2 kids kind of family. And I remember reading this really fabulous article of a couple who they had both been previously married and they both had children from their previous marriages. And so how did they integrate their blended family? And what they ended up doing was they bought 2 sides of a duplex together, and
Oh.
then they put in an adjoining door. And so on one side, the woman lived with her kids, and on the other side, the guy lived with his kids. And that way they would have, I think did something like, I don't know, they had shared family dinners like 3 or 4 nights a week. But then they also had nights where they would sort of just like separate and do their own thing. And then when the kids were with their other parents, the couple had would basically just like open it up and live together. And I just thought that was such a neat way of doing things, like in a way that is more supportive and inclusive of different family structures. And although that's an example with sort of a blended family situation in a relationship, I think there's something we need to start thinking about how something similar could be applied for single people. Because there are a lot of single adults who are 35, 45, 65, 75, then like they don't want to necessarily live alone, but they also don't want to have roommates. They have their own stuff. They want their own space. And, how can we make kind of communal living situations or build infrastructure where communal living is possible, where single adults can kind of have a best of both worlds, right? Like they have their own space and privacy when they want it, but they also have like communal areas where they can come together and have support. And I think that gets particularly important and cognizant as single women and adults get older because they become like structural concerns or just general concerns as you're aging that you want people around, you know? It may not necessarily be a romantic partner, but like I was listening to a podcast where 3 older single women all moved in together and
Kind of like Golden
one
Girls.
it was very Golden Girls, love it for them. One of them
Yes.
had never married, the other one was divorced after, like, 35 years of marriage or something, and the other one had lost her spouse, so she was a widow. And they all moved in together, and I think they really enjoyed it because, especially at older age, their concerns about, like, what happens if I fall over and I need someone to help me, or I say I'm popping out, but I never come home because for whatever reason, like, at least I know that there's someone there who's around who kind of is gonna provide that kind of support and that accountability for, like, my well-being. And so I don't think we fully kind of considered that as a society in the way that our houses are built and things like that. So, because it is, otherwise it's very expensive to be a single person, you know, paying rent or paying a mortgage by yourself, so
Well, and I think it's important to consider for everyone because I think there's definitely those instances too where we have our families or people have children and that there's that expectation to that those people are going to take care of us and that's not always the case either. Having like that other option for anybody that needs it,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and like I said, singlehood is it's something that we all experience. Everyone is
right?
born single, and a lot of us, even if we've been in relationships our entire life, will find ourselves single at some point. Either that's through separation or divorce, or the unfortunate case in which your spouse passes away. So I think I think often when people learn about singlehood studies, they people get really defensive. They think that we're saying you have to pick a side and this is like a you have to be super pro single or super pro relationship. And I really don't think that's what it is. Like I think I said earlier at the beginning of our like session today that I really see singlehood and relationships as two sides of the same coin. I don't like and they really are. Like it's an identity that we kind of move and a status that we move in and out of throughout our life. And it's important that we all have the skills to lead a solo single life in a way that's going to be functional and happy and fulfilled, whether or not that's because you want to be single by choice or because you find yourself single at some point in your life.
Yeah, like out of necessity or yeah. No, I think that's a very good point. And that kind of segues nicely into kind of the last questions I have. I know I want to be respectful of your time. I greatly appreciate you joining me today because I think, like you said, everyone is single at some point. So I know that you're married right now. So like what are because I think you touched on this too, that we often celebrate weddings and having children. But what I'm trying to do here is like elevate what are some amazing things women do when they're single. So what are like three accomplishments you're most proud of as a single woman or when you were single?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that I'm really proud of is definitely my career. It's something that, like I come from kind of like a my parents were immigrants. My parents, like, my mom, she went to college, but sort of got a degree for the sake of getting a degree, and my dad, he went to culinary school, so he never,
Oh,
no one in my family has ever done sort of hardcore tertiary education, and in fact, neither of them actually even knew anything about university.
yeah. Well, I come from a similar, yeah, I'm a first generation college student. So yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like, I think that's something that I really invested in myself. I mean, and I'm not saying that I did that by myself. I
Oh
totally
yeah.
had the support of my family and my friends and everything, and my mentors. But it's something that I really wanted for myself. And to be fair, I think it's something that my parents really wanted for like their daughters as well. And so that is something where I feel like I really invested in myself, and regardless of whether I was single or in a relationship, that always took priority, at least when I was younger and in a space where my career was a real focus, and so that's something that I think will always be with me, and it's something that I'm really, yeah, I'm happy that I invested that time and energy into it.
Yeah. And I think, it does take a lot of time. It can take away from a relationship. So it's good to do those things when you're young and you're single and you can do it at any point, right?
You can do it at a yeah, absolutely, you can do it at any point, but it is a lot of time, and it's interesting because actually recently I went into my older child's kindergarten class, and they were doing kinda like parents' career week or whatever. So I dressed up in my PhD robes, and I went to
Oh,
this
I
class.
love that.
And I was sort of trying to explain, because, like, how do you explain to a bunch of five-year-olds what a PhD is? And so
Yeah.
I was talking to them about, like, doctors and how there's different types of doctors. Some fix our bones and make us feel better, but other types are interested in answering questions about the world. And I said, "You know how you're in school right now? Well, when you finish school, I basically went to another school for grown-ups, and I spent another 10 years doing that."
Yeah.
And this
Right.
and this one girl, she was so sweet. She goes, "That sounds really challenging."
Oh,
And I was like, "You know what? It was."
yeah. Yeah.
So,
No.
yeah.
Well, and I think it's so important, especially coming from the education side for just for kids to have different examples. Women, men, different nationalities, like all these things, just being able to see so many different ways of doing things and how to get there kind of thing. So I'm really glad that you did that because I think, it's important to see there's different kind of doctors too.
Yeah, and I think that's really why I did it. Because, like, when I started school, I didn't know what a PhD was,
Right.
and
Oh, me
I
neither.
didn't know what, like, academia was or anything. So I think it's good for young kids to be exposed to, yeah, different careers and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I have one last question. So I know, like, if you can think back, or just in your research, I guess, like, what words of advice would you leave the women listening today with, like, if they're like they have that fear of being single or, they're struggling, kind of being stuck in a relationship? Like, what kind of words of advice would you leave?
Yeah, that's always hard because, one of the things that I've really come to realize doing this research is just in the same way that, like, no romantic relationship is ever going to be the same. People's singlehood experience is so diverse and so complex, and my singlehood experience is going to be different to yours, which is going to be different to someone else who's listening in. So I don't know if there's really like a one piece of advice, but I think really building a relationship with yourself is fundamental. Like, I have sort of said this already a few times, we were all born single. Like the relationship we have with ourselves is, one it's a really important one, and it's one that we carry with us throughout our life. And so I think whether people have these fears or insecurities or might be in relationships where they may be feeling not fully fulfilled, I think really trying to consider maybe where those fears are coming from, questioning that, and hopefully some of the things we've touched on today might kind of help bring light and awareness to maybe, oh yeah, why is it that I feel that way? Or why is it that I have that belief? And is it something that's really important to me? Or is it just something that I've been told has to be important?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And then kind of dovetailing with that is figuring out, what are your needs and how much of that can you like meet in a way like or do for yourself, like and maybe that's creating time for yourself, maybe that is investing in therapy. Maybe that is spending more time with family and friends outside of your romantic relationship. Whatever that looks like for people, I think that's just sort of worth considering.
Yeah, I think those are very, very wise words. And I think, we covered a lot of different topics today, but I love that. Like, just invest in yourself because at some point, at the end of the day, we only have ourselves, right? We have all these other people, but we're always with ourselves, right? So it's important that we build that relationship.
Yeah. And especially because sometimes we don't like, I think, especially in this context with singlehood, we don't always have control over society, right? Like, it's not like we're going to wake up tomorrow and this ideology of family and marriage is just going to disappear but I think what we do have is, like you said, we have ourselves, and you could be a really happy person and really build yourself up in a way that if you do experience challenges, if you do experience discrimination, you are in a frame of mind and you're in a place where you can better cope with and deal with those things. So, yeah.
No, that's so true. And I think those are good words to end on. And I just want to thank you again for taking the time and sharing your knowledge. And like I said before, I really look forward to following your research. I think what you're doing is so important and it's giving a voice, and I think that's what I'm trying to do here is like changing the narrative about singlehood, but also just kind of giving a voice and some agency to this growing group of people.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was really great to chat about this.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much and we'll chat soon.
Thanks, Rachel. Bye.